The Primordial One, who is the first descender, came to this world and created 4 gods from its body known as the 4 Shades. The Shades are celestial gods described to have higher power than the Archons, and they assisted the Primordial One to defeat the 7 dragon sovereigns. And in this video, we will try to identify these 4 Shades. But first, I would like to talk about another theory that I explained before. Basically, over 6,000 years ago, a war called the Great Calamity happened between the Primordial One and the Second Who Came. Although the current lore hints that the Primordial One won this war, but there's a theory that the Second Who Came is the actual winner. And then he impersonated the identity of the Primordial One, as well as using the Irminsul to alter everyone's memories and make them believe that he's the Primordial One, thus making the Second Who Came an imposter. May I remind you that this is just a summary, so if you want to know the theory in full details, then you can watch the video. And if you're interested on the Great Calamity, then you can check out this lore analysis video, which contains all the informations we have about this war, from the Sealies to the Solar Chariot. And if by any chance you're wondering about what happened to the Primordial One, then you can check out this Paimon theory video, which contains tons of proofs. Alright then, let's get back to our main theory, the identities of the 4 Shades. Starting off with the most known one, Kairos, also known as Istaroth. She is stated to be the shade of time and wind. And this is a canon information and not a theory. Next we have the unknown god, Asmoday. Her role as the sustainer of the heavenly principles only suggests that she is indeed a shade. That's because the Primordial One and Celestia represent the heavenly principles, while Asmoday is its sustainer. Plus she got star motifs, and they look like the primogems, which is short for primordial gem, as stated in the primogem description. And stars of that shape are seen in the name card of the hero's journey, which is an obvious symbolism to the Primordial One, because they're a god with a crown and wings. And not to mention Paimon, who is most likely a weakened small version of the Primordial One. Paimon and Asmoday look very identical, which would make more sense because the shades came from the Primordial One. And now, if Istaroth is the shade of time and wind, then Asmoday is the shade of what? Well, there is a theory that the artifacts represent the Primordial One and the 4 Shades. The Primordial One represents the circlet of Logos, because of the crown icon, and Logos means the principle of divine reason and creative order, which reminds me of the heavenly principles. Istaroth, the shade of time, represents the sands of Aeon, which is extremely obvious because of the timepiece icon, and Aeon means long period of time. Asmoday was a bit confusing to figure out, but thankfully now we know what shade she could be. As we all know, the unknown god looks very similar to Kiana, the Herrscher of Void. Therefore, the unknown god is the shade of Void and represents the goblet of Alhaitham, which means cup of void, and her element would be fire, because her cubes are red and orange, just like fire. Plus, the insides of her cubes emit a fire effect. And during the cataclysm, we can see her cubes next to Kanraya, which was lit up on fire and lava. And now we're left off with 2 unknown shades, who represent the flower of life and the plume of death, which means that one of them is the shade of life, while the other is the shade of death. But before that, I would like to talk about the Great Calamity again. As I said, there's a possibility that the Second Who Came won the war and used the Irminsul to trick all of Teyvat. And as we know, only descenders aren't bound to Irminsul's alterations. But I'll suggest a new probability. What if the 4 Shades aren't bound to these alterations as well? Because they were created from the Primordial One's body, who is a descender. And realistically, they should inherit the latter's descender traits, which means that the Shades know about the Primordial One's loss in the war, and about the imposter. But since the Irminsul changes didn't work on the Shades, the imposter took some actions with them. He probably forced Asmoday to work for him, since she's still in Celestia. And maybe this is killing her and will cause her to die. And the creator will come one day, possibly to save Asmoday. And this creator is most likely Paimon, the Primordial One, the creator of Teyvat, Celestia, and humans. And this is just more evidence that the real Primordial One is not currently at Celestia, which backs up my theory that there is an imposter. Next it's Istaroth, the shade of time. I think that the imposter, also called the Second Who Came, failed to catch her. since she's described to be every moment. And her statue in Inazuma is literally called the Omnipresent God. Plus, when the Great Calamity ended, Celestia laid a ban to prevent the Enkanamians to return back to the surface. I mean, if the Primordial One truly is the winner of the war, shouldn't they save the Enkanamians? The Enkanamians kept praying and praying, but Celestia ignored them. But then one day, Istaroth came and gave wisdom to someone in Enkanamia so he could build the Helios. Which means that Istaroth went against Celestia's actions. Which again means she doesn't agree with Celestia's ideals. Which proves that something is wrong with Celestia, implying that Celestia is not actually ruled by the Primordial One. And now, after knowing what happened to the Shade of Void and the Shade of Time, we will now move on to the Shade of Life and the Shade of Death. In case you didn't know, the Shade of Life was already mentioned in the lore before. The Primordial One and the Shade of Life created animals, plants, and humans. One more thing, in the achievement series of Enkanamia, we find an achievement called Kairos Constancy. As we all know, Kairos is Istaroth, the time shade. Constancy means being faithful and dependable, which perfectly describes Istaroth, as she helped the Enkanamians build the Helios. This achievement is about completing time trials. But then we see two other names, Phosphorus and Hesperus. In Greek mythology, Phosphorus and Hesperus are half-brothers. The fact that these two gods are mentioned alongside Kairos could only mean they're also shades. And now we finally know the names of the four shades: Kairos, Asmoday, Hesperus, Phosphorus. Okay, now let's move on and figure out who are the two unknown shades. Starting off with our first suspect.
This is getting interesting.
Morax is certainly one of the most mysterious characters, with suspicious moments, and being overall an anomaly when compared to the other Archons. Like being unable to give Wanderer the name Morax or Rex Lapis for unknown reasons, but being able to name him after the other Archons, except for his mom, obviously. And he's the only character whose constellation name doesn't match the name of his story quests. And he's always eyeless in cutscenes, while we can see the eyes of the other Archons. Well, that's just to name a few anomalies. Now I would like to prove that Morax is a shade. After Ruka Devata was successfully erased from the Irminsul by Nahida, everything changed, and that includes Zhongli's character story, which had a slight change. But what's intriguing is that Nahida replaced Ruka Devata. In other words, Nahida was always the Dendro Archon since thousands of years ago, which should mean that Nahida is now one of the original 7. But despite Zhongli's lore getting slightly altered, it still states that the only originals are Morax and Barbados. Which means that Zhongli remembers Ruka Devata and knows that Nahida isn't an original Archon. You can also say that he's aware that history can be changed, and knows that the Traveler can remember history because they're a descender. According to the Mist-Veiled Primo Elixir description, this item is an elixir that mirrors how the world was when it was first created. But a certain someone knows that this is not the case. Well, in order to know the identity of this mysterious person, we have to analyze this item. The elixirs are materials only found in Liu. They're made by the Adepti, and the certain someone must be knowledgeable and old in order to know how the world was. So from this, we know that this person is Zhongli because he is from Liu, is an Adepti, old and knowledgeable. Next, I would like to talk about something that surprisingly nobody mentioned before, and the strongest piece of evidence too, and it has been in front of us for more than 2 years, and it's all thanks to Azhdaha. To start off, Azhdaha called Morax an usurper, a term also used for the Primordial One.
Although my hatred for that usurper from beyond the heavens still stirs deep within me.
An usurper is a person who takes a position of power or importance illegally or by force, which is basically what the Primordial One and the Shades did when they arrived to this world. They fought the dragon sovereigns who used to rule the old world, and then they became the new rulers of the new world. The fact that Azhdaha, who is heavily hinted to be the Geo Sovereign, called Morax an usurper, could only mean that the latter is a shade. Next, he proceeds to relate Morax to the dawn of the age of mankind, which means the beginning of the human race.
But I was a god of mankind. My identity may change, but my eyes will bear witness to the history of humanity.
And then Azhdaha associates Morax to the litany of atrocities done by humanity's ancestors during the Old World. Litany of atrocities means a long list of bad and repeated things, while the Old World refers to the era of the Sovereign's rulership. Humanity's ancestors should refer to the Primordial One and the Shades, and not the first humans of Teyvat. That's because the humans didn't even exist yet during the war between Celestia and the Sovereigns. In the perspective of Azhdaha, a dragon king from the Old World, the Primordial One and the Shades' actions are cruel. Next, I would like to talk about his true age and origins.
As you know, I've dwelt upon this world for more than 6,000 years.
Notice how he said, dwelled upon this world, instead of born in this world, or something of the similar. We know Vendi is a wind spirit born from the branches of time. Raiden is an incarnation of lightning. Nahida is a branch from Mermansel. But we know nothing about this man's origins. And no, he's not a dragon. That's just one of his many vessels. And well, yes, he is an Adeptus. But how did he even become one? Or was it just a name and race he came up with? Because he is the first and oldest Adeptus. Well, there's a theory that Morax came from the Solar Chariot. The Solar Chariot is a sun that fell on Liu after the Moon Sisters died during the Great Calamity, which should have happened over 6,000 years ago. And let's not forget the unholy amount of sun symbolism for Morax. And from this, we could say that Morax fell from the sky using the Solar Chariot after the Great Calamity, which we already theorized. The winner is the second who came. Now we move on to the next question. Why was he sent down? According to the book Stone Tablet Compilations, Volume 1, it says that Morax has descended, but in the Chinese translation it says demoted. Demotion is a reduction in rank or status. Coincidence? I think not. And just as Dainsleif once said,
there are no coincidences in the world. Everything is the fruit of seeds planted long ago. Time is just waiting for those seeds to sprout.
I don't believe his story is anywhere near finished yet.
It could be that the second who came is the one responsible for the demotion of Morax from Shade to normal god. Or Morax demoted himself on his own because he refused to serve for an imposter. And they signed a contract. Morax wouldn't tell a soul about him being a Shade, and about the ruler of Celestia being an imposter. And then Morax was demoted to Teyvat as an ordinary god with a new identity. And this happened 6,000 years ago. But him as a Shade, he was much older than 6,000. To put it simply, I'm gonna use an example. Zhongli's current identity is an ordinary mortal in his 20s or 30s. And before that, he took the identity Morax, the Geo Archon, who's 6,000 years old. And before all of this, he was a Shade with an unknown age, but older than 6,000. There's also a deleted zhongli voice line that's quite interesting.
Celestia. I have not been back in a long time.
It seems like Zhongli misses Celestia. Next, I want to talk about some other tiny details and additional evidence that Morax is a Shade. As we all know, Mora is a currency created by Morax, and on it we can find a triquetra. Triquetras are mostly seen on ancient civilizations that worship the Primordial One and the Shades. It's also seen on Paimon, who's theorized to be the Primordial One, and it's the symbol of the Omni element, which is the combination of all 7 elements. In TCG, Paimon gives us 2 dices of the Omni, and surprisingly, this card with zhongli on it gives us 3 dices of the Omni. And it's pretty weird, since the other event cards with the Archons on them don't do such thing. And as we know, stars are mostly associated with the Primordial One and the Shades. As an example, Paimon, who's theorized to be the Primordial One, has multiple star motifs.
Paimon? What a fascinating being. You two give off not only the essence of wind and earth, but also of... yes, the stars.
Same case for Zhongli. Aside from all the sun symbolism he has, he's also been compared to a star. And in his charged attack, he transforms into a star. Not only that, but some of his abilities also have star effects. The star of Asmoday and the star of Morax are the same. They even got yellow eyes. Cubes. Diamond-shaped shields. Also, have you noticed this? And now, after I finally gave proof that Zhongli could be a shade, let's now move on to what shade he could be. But first, let's do a little recap. The Goblet of Alhaitham represents Asmoday, the shade of void. The Sands of Aeon represents Istaroth, the shade of time. The Flower of Life represents the shade of life, who I think is Zhongli. But in order to prove that, I would have to give proof that Morax has life-related abilities. Morax created life before, he created flowers. Created animals such as birds and whales. Gave a pair of eyes to Azhdaha.
I never did forget your gift of sight.
I hardly lifted a finger. Think nothing of it.
A pair of eyes. From Morax to Azhdaha.
Morax also created antlers for Skybracer. It's also said that Earth is the basis of all life and where alchemy gets its name.
Your soil gave birth to human life. It's an ancient power with unmistakable properties.
And now, after finally proving that Morax is the shade of life, we will then find out what's his real name. Remember this? We're introduced to the names Phosphorus and Hesperus alongside Kairos, which could be a hint that these two are also shades. And as I said before, the titles and the objectives go along with the names of the shades. As constancy fits Kairos and the achievement objective is completing time trials. And if we take a look at the achievement called Hesperus Boons, first of all, boon means a thing that is helpful or beneficial, like money as an example. The objective is to open chests which obviously contain boons or wealth, like Mora. The creator of Mora is none other than Morax, and Morax was said to be wealth itself. Which means that Hesperus is indeed Morax, the shade of life. But does this mean that Mora existed since the dawn of mankind? Since we can find Mora inside the chests and boxes in Enkanomiya and other ancient civilizations, we must also remember that Mora isn't created from the Geonosis. This is a famous misinformation spread in the fandom. Mora comes from Zhongli's flesh and blood. I already made a separate video about this topic. You can find the link in the description. Now, we're left off with Phosphorus, the shade of death. If you have seen my theories before, you would know that I already talked about Hesperus and Phosphorus in a different video. It's this video right here, a theory about Morax and Scarlet King being brothers. I started off by pointing out the multiple similarities between them, and then gave evidence that they represent the original Greek mythology versions of Hesperus and Phosphorus. I highly recommend you go watch this video before continuing, as it's extremely important for this theory. I'll leave the link of this video in the description. Since Morax is Hesperus, the shade of life, and Hesperus and Phosphorus are half-brothers in Greek mythology, while keeping in mind that Morax and Scarlet King might be brothers, then, with simple maths and logic, Scarlet King can also be a shade, specifically Phosphorus, the shade of death. But please don't worry, as this isn't a baseless theory. I have proof to back up what I said. Starting off with why Scarlet King is a shade. He is stated to be a son of the sky. Usually, sky can refer to the heavens, aka Celestia. It's also stated that when he looks up to the sky, he recalls the boundless paradise, which is the celestial atlas. He also recalls the merciless rain from thousands of years ago. But what's interesting, in the Chinese translation, it says that he was mercilessly punished. From all of this, we learn that he was a celestial god who was punished thousands of years ago. Could this mean that he too got demoted? Well, I've got another piece of evidence. King Deshret brought forbidden knowledge to this world.
The Scarlet King brought this forbidden knowledge into our world, and it quickly spread like a plague.
So what exactly is forbidden knowledge?
It's a kind of knowledge that doesn't belong to this world, and a form of truth that can't be understood. It came from the very bottom of the abyss. Even I could never understand it.
This forbidden knowledge is like a corruption, a pollution to this world. Yet King Deshret didn't seem to get any negative effects. It's as if he's not originally from this world, just like the Shades. Next, I want to show you the striking similarity between his civilization and the civilization of the Primordial One, Salvin Dagner. Credits to this person for noticing this detail. And now let's try and find out what happened to him after the Great Calamity. As we know, King Deshret was punished, most likely by the second who came, the imposter. His punishment was probably getting some of his memories as a shade erased in some unknown way, which would explain why he forgot how the world was created, and only found out when Nabu Malakata, who is a Seelie, told him. He even said he forgot the primordial language, which implies he knew it before. He also mocked the actions that Celestia started taking after the Great Calamity, and he wanted to rebel against Celestia. He even refused the gift of the Divine Throne, which is probably a gnosis. I would also like to associate the theory of Alhaitham being a vessel of the Scarlet King. I already made a video explaining this theory, link in the description if you're interested. Anyways, the reason I brought up Alhaitham is because of the cape he wears. As you can see, on the back of his cape, we find 4 stars, which could be a nod to the 4 shades. And as we know, stars of that shape are heavily associated with the shades and the Primordial One. And now, after I gave all the evidence that King Deshret might be a shade, next I will give proof that he's the shade of death. And that's by showing you King Deshret's connections to death. As we know before, the remaining god is Phosphorus. The achievement Phosphorus's guidance is about guiding the Seelie to their courts. It's as if we're guiding them to their resting place, where they would stay there forever, as if. That's a coffin. Well, not only is King Deshret said to be the guide of the living and the dead, but he also built a coffin for his dead friend Nabu Malakata, who is a Seelie, which fits the achievement and its objective so well. As we all know, King Deshret is depicted with a bird head. And if he's the death shade, then it would perfectly fit the plume of death because it's a bird feather. I also came across this tweet by this person. The sarcophagus of King Deshret has some writings in the desert language. And when translated, starting from the left side, we get 2 names of different gods. The first one is Amon, which is the name of King Deshret. Below it is Keni Ament. Keni Amentiu is a Nancian Egyptian deity, whose name means foremost off the Westerners, where Westerners refers to the dead. Keni Amentu's name was also used as a title for Osiris and Danubis. Osiris is the Egyptian lord of the underworld and judge of the dead. Anubis was an ancient Egyptian god of the dead. Are you seeing just how many death references are there for King Deshret? The funny part is there's more, and I'm not done yet. There's this domain called the Court of Desolation, built during the era of King Deshret, where the dead can be brought back to life. And there's this place called the Bottomless Hall. It's created by King Deshret, aimed to work as the underworld and paradise. This place is also called Duat Hall. The Duat is the underworld in ancient Egyptian mythology. The god Osiris was believed to be the lord of the underworld. If we take a look at Alhaitham's idol animation, he creates 3 words written in Sumeru script, and after translating them, we get telos, huli, dunamis, which respectively mean final cause, material cause, potentiality. But this doesn't matter. What matters is the letters that Alhaitham picks out. He picks out these letters. Together they spell Elm. In Greek mythology, elm trees are the symbols of the underworld, melancholy, and death. Or it could simply mean knowledge in Arabic, and I'm just overthinking it. But seriously, with all the death mentions we've seen so far regarding King Deshret, this could not be as stretch as it looks. And now to conclude. Paimon is the Primordial One. Kairos is the shade of time. Asmoday is the shade of void. Morax is Hesperus, the shade of life. Amun is Phosphorus, the shade of death. And now we've finally reached the end of this theory. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please consider subscribing if you like this type of content. Thanks for watching and see you soon.